Welcome to the Workshop 5 lecture. Today we're going to talk about research-informed learning, and I'm going to work through the two readings that are set for you in this particular workshop. And as you can see, I've got the first one here, which is the Marianne Knauss paper. And I've highlighted some aspects of the reading. You won't have these highlighted in your copy, but as we go through, I will talk to some of the issues that are prompted by these highlighted sections. And really the point of doing this is to try to help you understand the role of research in your practice and understanding what's happening in the kindergarten space and the interactions you'll have with children, but also their behaviours. It's often persuasive not to engage with theory. It's often have an opinion that theory is for university and it's for your assignments and it doesn't really have a place out in practice. But actually, the readings that I've chosen through this course hopefully get you to understand their vital role in helping you to understand what's going on in the kindergarten space, but also help you to problem solve, help you to produce new ideas and new strategies and so on. It's very hard to kind of think of kindergarten or understand kindergarten or the early childhood sector in a vacuum. It is an institutional system, an education system, and therefore it just can't be thought of as separate to society. And because it is an institutional system, it's really important that you at least have some kind of theoretical grasping of the society in which you work, and its impacts on education and on systems generally. So, as I suggested in the Canvas introduction to this particular workshop, this is focused on that word that the course is named after, being. This is a term that is in the EYLF. And so Knauss, the author here, has taken this term and has thought about it through different kind of theoretical and philosophical lenses and interpretations. So as we read through the paper, I want you to think about a couple of things. One is the actual content, so the topics that Knauss talks about, and how the paper is actually constructed to give you a story about the EYLF. But the second thing to think about is how Knauss weaves theory into practice and into policy. Because of course the EYLF is a policy document, so there are a number of different facets of society that are being pushed in together in this paper, and it gives you if you like, a kind of methodological approach for doing that within your own work. So it's not just the topic I want you to think about, but the act of putting these things together that Knauss has done that you can learn from as well. So as we go through, hopefully you'll make some notes and you'll think about whether you agree with the points raised, but also I want you to think methodologically about how you do this type of putting together in terms of the materials that are in this course and your growing understanding of practice and any past experiences you've had of working with young children. Okay, so the title of the paper is Time for Being, Why the Australian Early Years Learning Framework Opens Up New Possibilities. And so the two statements I've highlighted from the abstract if you're not used to reading academic papers, they will always have an abstract, which is a kind of summary of what the whole piece is about, and allows you, as you are browsing through the library, to kind of quickly understand what this particular thing is about, and whether this paper, and whether it's something you would want to read. So in the abstract, the first thing that I've highlighted is where she says the response has been to establish government-sanctioned curriculum frameworks based on current research and the dominant discourses of educational provision. So, as you've probably discussed in your prior courses, and certainly we've mentioned it in earlier workshops in this course, is how the EYLF is itself constructed, and what's informed it as a policy document. And so teams of people come together across the sector that are related to early childhood education care in some way or form. And that group of people is very diverse. It can include people like yourselves, people who are early childhood educators, directors of services, people like myself, academics, professors, researchers in early childhood, then people from the Department of Education, people from social services and docs, people who are professionals in the field in terms of perhaps other types of services that young children use, medical profession, psychology profession, and so on. And so each of those people who come together and write the EYLF have their own theories that they bring into that process. And in fact, when the federal government, McKeecher, commissioned this framework, it was understood that theory would be very prevalent and present in the actual framework document. So this is not an anti-intellectual framework, it's quite the opposite. And so, but the theorising and the research doesn't stop with that EYLF. As it starts to be enacted and brought into play within the sector, there's other research and theory that needs to sit around that as it gets used on a day-to-day basis. So the importance clearly is not to historicise that research, but to continue to produce research that is theoretically informed, so that children's services and children's education can continue to be developed and refined. So that statement, I think, is really a good clue as to telling you how important research and theory is in actually informing practice and policy. So the next, I'm not going to read the paper, by the way. I'm just going to hop and skip to these highlighted sections. I would like you to read the paper on your own steam. Hopefully you've already done that. If you haven't, perhaps pause this lecture at this point and read both the papers, and then come back and watch the rest of this lecture so that you can understand some of what is being talked about. So the next section is what this article is about. So it aims to provide insights into the meaning and importance of being in the context of early childhood education and care settings. So it's doing a very specific thing. We know that being, belonging, and becoming, or becoming, being, and belonging, or the other way around, the early years learning framework, belonging, being, and becoming, I only ever used the EYLF, so I'm a bit rusty on the order of those terms, but I do know that being is in the middle. What Naus is doing is she's taking up just the being part, which is why I really liked this article, because it's what we are about in this course, is this notion of being, and how being a child in this time, how we explore that through STEAM learning and industry connected development, and also play-based pedagogies and so on. So Naus here has doing the same thing. She's really curious about this term being and what has informed this term. Why is it used? These words were not put together prior to the EYLF. These terms were constructed for the EYLF. So the people who wrote the framework said, how can we title this? And they came up with, the belonging, being, and becoming sequence. And so she's taken up this notion, this word being, and its loaded associations. And she's drawing on the next sentence is where she says she draws on Heidegger's ontological explanation of the concept of being. And so she's taken one particular philosophy of existence, if you like, of which there are many. And she goes through in a later part of the paper to kind of summarize or present a kind of overview, a quick overview of the various philosophies and philosophic works on existence, because it's been a major kind of preoccupation of philosophers for a very, very long time, like millennia. But she's taken up Heidegger as as a particular philosopher, and Heidegger is somebody who actually used the word being. And so she's saying, what does Heidegger's ontological explanation? So ontology is the theory of truth or reality. And so what's the kind of reality of being, of existence, and what it means to be, and why it's significant in early childhood. So she's not kind of removing the word and going, what does that mean? I'm going to look it up in the dictionary. She's actually understanding that to kind of have a deeper engagement with this policy document, she actually needs to continue to work with theory and research to kind of develop her ideas. So as we go through the paper, there's the introduction, which sets out in more detail the reason for the article, and here she states that it's the background, the kind of run up, the wider context to the paper, and she gives a little bit of wider information about the construction of the EYLF, and why it was kind of constructed, what was the prompt for it. And what really informed it by the group of people who wrote it, who I mentioned just before, that kind of eclectic group of people connected to early childhood, what was informing them, and what did they want to bring in to the policy document. So she says here, and quite rightly, she's quite correct in this, that it was informed by various studies, including brain research. Like at the time of the EYLF being written, it was at a time when neuroscience has been around for a very long time, but all of a sudden it seemed to be coming into the discourses of education and the discourses particularly of early childhood, and so the influence of brain research was taken up quite vehemently by early childhood educators and scholars. And it was really to leverage the importance of having early childhood education and care. A lot of the neuroscience kind of advocated for these kind of windows of opportunity ideas, so that if we tap into children's moments in time where they're learning this skill or that skill, then we kind of open up all this potential for the child. Whereas if those moments pass, then that opportunity is gone. So it has a very developmental kind of association, neuroscience, in the ways that it was being taken up by educators. So, and when I'm talking about this, I'm not necessarily agreeing or aligning with these theories, but I am kind of trying to explain the different theories that were informing the EYLF. And then there were also education programs that were based on research. The other one that they've mentioned here, the effective provision of preschool education, or EPI, and that was an international research program that was coming out of the UK. They also looked at countries like Singapore, Finland, many parts of the world, whereby they could say, well, what part of this education system do we like, and would we like to adopt? What sections do we want to try and take into the EYLF? So the next section here that I've highlighted, the pre-primary approach, is underpinned by goals and outcomes relating to preparation for school, with subject areas such as literacy and mathematics. According to Cochrane, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and the United Kingdom fall into this category. So it's about, what she's talking about here is what are the kind of pedagogic approaches, or the emphases of other frameworks. What is the type of framework that they are talking about? So, we have a play-based approach, but different parts of the world have different approaches. So this is where she's summarizing. So the social pedagogic approach, which is what she's named here, the first one is the pre-primary approach, is underpinned by goals and outcomes relating to preparation for school, and she lists the countries there. And the second one, which is a social pedagogic approach, values open frameworks with an emphasis on children's interests, quality interactions, and the broad areas of emotional well-being, communication, and general knowledge. And in this category are the Nordic countries, New Zealand, and Australia. So if you think that all ECE frameworks are kind of neutral documents, you need to rethink that. And this is why it's really important to remind you of the role of research on these policy documents, because they make different kinds of policy documents. And so the EYLF, she says at the end there, is an open curriculum, play-based rather than subject-based. And that's why we have those 5 outcomes, the 5 very general statement outcomes that you can apply to any type of topic or activity. But what underpins them, as we've talked earlier, and no doubt in your other courses, about how the EYLF is enacted, and that's through play-based curricula. And so she continues on to talk about the various framework documents that are across the world, and the ones that have particularly had an influence on the EYLF, the development of the EYLF. And she says here, even though the EYFS, which is the UK framework, and TCHE, which is the New Zealand framework, represent opposite ends of Bennett's continuum of models, the pre-primary approach and the social pedagogic approach, that's the two, it's like seen at different ends of an approach, and Bennett talks about the differences between them. Critics have recommended the same suggestion, that is, that the quality of the educator is critical to the successful implementation of any learning framework. So that's why it's important, not just for the people who are writing the document to do that theoretical work. You are an active participant and continue to be so every day that you are working with children. You are an active participant and need to uphold the quality through your own active maintaining of theory and maintaining of your professional practice. This is not babysitting. This is not a passive occupation where you just set things out and then you sit in a corner and watch the children play. This is absolutely the opposite of that. So vital that you understand theories, and it's vital that you continue to understand those theories, and it's vital that you employ those theories and research every day of your professional career, because things change all the time, and you need to kind of understand how things are changing. And it's not just what we understand about children, but if this year alone has been anything to go by, it's the wider social contexts around children's lives. So, we've had the most extraordinary things happen just in this year alone. Environmental, racial, social, medical, economic. I mean, it just goes on, and we're only halfway through the year. So, you know, vital that you engage with all those wider things, because they have a direct impact on your ability as an educator to work with young children and the framework documents. So what they say here is that the theoretical bases of a curriculum may be beyond the understanding of many educators. So, you know, it might be that you don't know who Heidegger is or any of the other theories that have informed. So that's not an excuse to walk away from that. It's about you going, I actually need to learn about these things. I actually need to, you know, I've committed to this role and I've committed to this profession. So therefore, I actually need to read about these things. And so they need time and assistance to conceptualize new practices. So what this whole paper is about is the vital role of theory and research-based learning on the lives and education of young children. They do, so you know, they Naus does say it's important that research is translated into practical actions and is focused on teaching examples to create improved practices. Okay, so this is why you should participate in all your university-based learning, because this is where you get that experience. And it's the primary place where you get that experience. You don't really get that experience anywhere else. So, you know, this is why it's very important to participate in your learning here and to read these papers. They've been carefully selected for you, so that these people have done the translation. People like myself talking about the stuff gives you the further translation. So, you know, it's really important that you engage with that learning while you're here, so that if it seems really very difficult to understand, you can be advised on how it translates into the practical in terms of your everyday interactions. So they advocate that educators develop clearer theoretical understandings through publications, professional development courses, and including of research findings in training. So, you know, participate, be an active participant in your professional development, go along to things, read, join organisations, go to the teacher development days, and just be an active, inquisitive person in your career. So they say for educators to successfully follow through curriculum frameworks, they need a sound understanding and grounding of the theory behind the practice. Otherwise, it's you kind of always working kind of half informed, and so if you're struggling to understand how these really theoretical concepts and philosophies have anything to do with early childhood, you need to read more of your course materials and the papers on your reading list, because that's where it's explained to you. Okay, so you can't just, it's very hard for you to try and figure that out by yourself. So you do need to engage with the readings. So after all of this kind of introduction, she talks here, this article focuses on the concept of being and aims to provide both philosophical and practical insights into its significance in early childhood care settings. So here she is doing that linking work for you. So who's Heidegger? So Heidegger, as she explains here, is a German philosopher. So he was a particular kind of philosopher. He was interested in existence, hence why he's known as an existentialist philosopher. So he was really fixed on this notion of what is existence, what is to be. You can see the dates of his main body of work here in the 1920s. And so he used philosophy to open up the question of being, to provide meaning to one's everyday existence. What does that mean? You know, we don't think about it, obviously, because it's permanent, it's perpetual. But philosophers like Heidegger were really quite curious about trying to make sense of this thing of existence, this notion of existence. So Heidegger believed that philosophers were asking the wrong kinds of questions. These are other types of philosophers, centering their investigations on our being as an entity or a substance with properties, rather than asking about being itself. So in the prior, if you look at the prior paragraph, Naus goes through the history of philosophers or theorists right the way back to the kind of the 4th century, and Aristotle. And she does a very, very quick timeline, just this paragraph here about the timeline of people leading up to the 20th century, and people kind of being curious about being, what it is to be alive, what is this notion of being alive, what does that mean, but also being conscious of it. And so the kind of the human question, I guess, the human existential question. So Heidegger also read those prior theories, but he disagreed with some of the ideas that these other philosophers and theorists had. So he felt that being as an entity or substance was not, with properties, was not exactly getting at the heart of it. It was about being itself, how one exists and encounters things. Heidegger argued that we are not simply a physical property, but exist with others in our active engagement with the world. This perspective views being not in terms of physics, chemistry, or biology, which the prior theories had tended to do, but rather in our everyday dealings with the world. So experience and the energies of existing and kind of being active. This is what Heidegger called ontic knowledge, knowledge pertaining to the distinctive nature of particular types of entity as they are. So ontic, if you remember, is the idea of reality or truth. What is actual? So it's how people construct, not how, that's epistemology, but what that knowledge is. How they get there is the epistemology of ontology. That's another conversation. All right, so hence understanding experience is situated in a world and in ways of being. So it's the experiencing of it, of existence, that actually, in Heidegger's ideas, brought about this sense of being. This is how we start to understand it. And she goes on to talk about how Heidegger theorized that particular theory and how he described it and how it was slightly different to this historic study of existence. And then she says, well, how does this relate to childhood? And she talks about, she translates the Heideggerian kind of ideas into a childhood context. And she thinks about how Heidegger can inform how we understand being in terms of the EYLF through this kind of experience and living, this notion of living. So she's proposing that Heidegger's theory is really important to understand, or at least know about, because it impacts on how we are thinking of the child as they are in early childhood education and care. So she says here, it's important for educators to fully grasp the meaning of being, not only to understand their own being, but to be responsive to the unfolding of children as they are becoming. So when you're not engaging in these deeper ideas, I'm not suggesting here that you go and read about Heidegger or that you understand these kind of difficult theories. It's totally fine not to fully grasp that at this point. But what you must at least understand is that just watching children, just kind of interacting with children is not enough. It's not enough if your career choice is to be an early childhood educator. You must understand that there are bigger theories underpinning this, and that you at least acknowledge those, and that you at least attempt to read about them and think more deeply about the everyday in your workplace. Because otherwise, what happens, sadly, is that those educators become babysitters. They don't think deeply or critically about what's happening in the education space and in the rooms that the children are in. And so without that kind of deep engagement, it becomes a fairly mindless activity, and the quality of what happens with children falls, sadly. So what tends to happen is the EYLF, or the Victorian framework, is just taken up kind of instrumentally, if you like. So it's used word for word, and it doesn't. There's nothing kind of extensive going on beyond it. It's not really kind of dealt with conceptually, or it's not very sophisticated. So here's where she says, it's important to grasp. She also understands that it's a big ask of people who might not be reading theory, or maybe they've never read philosophy and just can't, maybe just wouldn't know where to start. So what she says here is she's helping you. She's giving you examples. So the article draws on examples of vignettes from an in-depth qualitative study. So she talks about the research methods, and here she talks about the analytical approaches, and how the analytical approaches to the field work is actually helping her to discuss some of the theories that she's promoted around existence and being. So she said here, a hermeneutic phenomenological approach allowed me to make sense of the human experiences I was observing. So she wasn't just kind of observing field study without a second thought, if you like. She was actually analysing with those philosophies and theories and concepts in mind. So that was running through her head as she was doing the field work for her study. And then she describes how this hermeneutic phenomenological approach took place. So she's not just kind of throwing that term out. She's actually describing how that was enacted in the field notes that she took and the observations. And she says here that through recursive writing, an iterative process was implemented using a forward and backward arc. And she explains what that means in the following paragraphs. And here what she's saying is, I was writing, reading and revising the experiences in a backward and forward journey using theoretical perspectives from Heidegger, Levinas, Foucault and Van Manen. And so she's listing all the theorists that she's reading, and how their thoughts around being, existence, are informing her as she's observing these field events, in the early childhood spaces that she's researching. And so through this recursive writing, she articulates here interpretations, and that this is what's referred to as these hermeneutic phenomenologies, as it is both descriptive and interpretive of the meaningful lived experience. And she says here, hermeneutic inquiry has the potential to uncover meanings and intentions that may go unrecognized, and gains a deeper understanding of the text. So she's explaining here what she's doing with her observations, and how she's making sure that what she's observing is really carefully thought about and really carefully interrogated. So it's not just this casual observation of children doing things in the early childhood space. So she then goes on to describe the two different sites that she's working with, and it rotates around two families, and you can read that in detail. But I highlighted this paragraph because I really liked how she kind of thought about what she was seeing. So she goes through this comparison of two families and their home situation, and that she uses a quote from one of the interviews she's done with one of the children in those families. And what I like about this this highlighted paragraph is how she's thinking critically about what this kind of throwaway comment is that this child has made. And she talks about not being late for school. And so she says, for Christy, going to school and being on time has become an important priority in her life and has been instilled through the belief systems and discourses that regulate her. Discourse can influence how we act in the world, the way we speak, think, feel, and be. Children's lives are embedded within social and cultural structures of a given society, and therefore are subject to influences from their environment. Christie has adopted the rules and conforming to cultural practices. One particular constraint for Christie was the school starting time. Mia is 4 years old and does not go to school, so according to Christie, this is their sisters, has no reason to rush in the mornings. It's suggested by Mulhall that Heidegger conceives of the human way of being as essentially conditioned. Foucault referred to institutional practices as normalizing behaviour, and that life processes are shaped by the implementation of this power. So it's important to recognise these normalising behaviours that impede our everyday relations with young children. And so that helps you understand that nothing is neutral. The child suddenly becomes aware of time is not because she's suddenly become aware of time. It's been kind of instructed or implemented through the wider things that she's living through. So she's suddenly going to an institution whereby everything is regulated through the school bell and times and lengths of durations and so on. And so she's becoming institutionalized and is normalizing certain practices and behaviors through participating in that institutional structure, which is school. So the paper goes on to talk about other aspects of the field work that she's been doing, and then she's using the field observations to think about this deeper question of being, and this young children understanding the possibilities of life and what it is to exist. And so she talks about that a little bit more in terms of young children. And then she thinks about this type of being, so being in the moment. And she says here, Heidegger explained that in our lives, there should be time for being in the moment as it is an essential part of our being. And she says here, very young children do not know how to tell the time or read a clock, nor are they concerned with how much or how long. And so she goes back to the field study to kind of help develop her theories and ideas and to give examples, or what we call empirical evidence, based on what she's gathered. And she weaves the theory back into these observations. So what she's doing in this part of the paper is she's saying, well, you know what, I think in early childhood, being is this, and I think, the idea of existence is this. And then what she's using to help support her growing ideas and her growing theoretical understanding is the combination of the theory that she's reading, the philosophy, and the field studies that she's observed. So when you're in the field, your kind of field studies is your everyday practice, right? So this is something that this author has done as a research project, but you kind of have that as a daily practice in your teaching. And so keeping abreast of theories and reading these kind of theorized pieces of work, you get to then see it every day rather than trying to get a research project up. You know, this person now is probably not exposed to children every day because she probably doesn't work in a child care centre. Whereas if you're encountering children every day through your teaching or educating practice, you're having that exposure, this empirical experience. And so it's vital, really, that you actually continue to engage in these theoretical pieces of work so that you can look anew at what's around you and think about how you can enrich what is happening in those daily practices, right? So it's not just about the benefit of this to you as an individual and how you become, you know, more informed or, you know, a more clever person or whatever, although that's a fantastic thing to happen as well. It's actually, well, what can I now do that's different with the children I am educating and working with? And this is what she's kind of talking about. And so in conclusion here, she said she's outlined the notion of being, drawing on Heidegger's theoretical framework, to recognize that every person has their own being and that each person is unique. And it affirms that being has many possibilities. So she's starting to get a really sophisticated understanding of this notion of existence in relation to young children. Whereas even a really smart person would struggle to articulate that without doing this research work, without reading the theories and thinking about this and engaging with this type of research activity. So, you know, even the smartest people need to do this work, and engage with this field of study, you know, philosophy and theory and empirical research, to actually expand their own ideas. And this is the vital thing that this paper is about. So who one becomes as a being occurs through the choices made and the pathways followed in life. Therefore, the role of the educator is crucial, this is just here, in facilitating a child's ability to be. This can happen by being in tune with the personal rhythms of individual children, being flexible and allowing time for the children to be in the moment. The introduction of the EYLF now explicitly enables educators to make the shift, to reframe their understanding, and to assist children to engage with the events of life in an authentic way. Children can be provided with opportunities that allow for time to be in the moment, time to play, time to be with others, time to simply be. So really, what's happening here is not that suddenly you'll go, okay, everything goes out the window, I'm not going to do any of the activities I've done with the children before, everything's new. That's not what happens at all. It's about enhancing and enriching and being just better at being the educator with the interactions that you have with children. If you remember, in one of the earlier lectures, I talked about how it was in the play-based pedagogies lecture, and how our notions of pedagogy have shaped what education looks like for children over the years. And I talked about my grandparents' education experiences and how they sat in rows with a little chalk tablet, and listened to a teacher all day, and didn't have any active engagement in their learning, and they had to do rote learning, and they all had to do the same thing, and if it wasn't the same, they got a ruler wrapped over their knuckles. Now, if you think about how theory and philosophy works, that's what happens to education. It's moved us from that space to where we are with children in schools today, which is, it's like immeasurably better. It's completely different, and that is down to people actually engaging with theory, engaging with philosophy, and thinking, well, I'm still going to be a teacher and I'm still going to work with children, but how do I do it better? How do I make sure that this stuff that I'm reading and this theory and ideas that I'm reading, this is, just completely changed my mind, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to just really refine and improve this experience. So those children in my grandparents' time still went to school for the same hours in the day as children go to school now, and they still go to a school with a classroom, and they still have lessons and lunch. But what happens within those parameters is entirely different. And it is based on theories and research and ideas about learning. It's not just let's just experiment with this. It's actually based on research-based teaching and learning. Okay, so vital that you continue to do that, because as ideas about children and learning continue to improve and continue to enrich, then we can make things continue to improve. I'll go back to what's happened in the last month. So, as you know, what's happened very recently is a terrible thing happened in the US. An awful piece of racist violence happened, and in reaction to the death of George Floyd, people around the world kind of had a lot of white people, especially, had a bit of an awakening, and the hard campaigning and the hard advocacy that has been going on in all countries of the world by people of color was kind of, listened to finally by a lot of white folks, and people marched and had the Black Lives Matter rallies. And if that doesn't impact on how we think about the presence of race, or the exclusion, or the kind of racist practices that underpin education sites, then I don't know why we have education, quite frankly. So that's an example. If you think that we're actually at a point where education is already really good and it's already really informed and we don't need to do any more, what's happened in the last month should tell you that we still have a lot of work to do. So in a kindergarten space, that would be, whose lives are reflected in the pictures on the wall, whose lives are reflected in the resources, whose lives are reflected in the language that we use, in the welcomes, in the foodstuffs, in the routines, in the acknowledgements of diversity. That still has a long way to go in early childhood. It is still very much a white space, even though the children that are there are diverse and from many different family circumstances and different ethnicities and different cultural backgrounds. So we still have a long, long way to go. And so that very thing that's happened in the last month should at least tell you that super, super important to engage with theory, to engage with philosophy, to listen and read the voices of the people who deal with these things. And then as educators, we go, you know what? I am committed to actually making the space better than it was. So, I'm going to make sure I make a commitment to Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to enact this in my early childhood centre, and I'm going to change things, and I'm going to read the theory, I'm going to read the pieces of writing, I'm going to watch the films, I'm going to look at the debates, I'm going to engage with all those kinds of ideas, and I'm going to make it better. So that in itself is as good a reason as any to continue to work with theory, to have research informed teaching in your daily practice.